Growing up, I always knew my mom was the kind of person who made sure everything was okay. She was the type who checked for monsters under my bed whenever I told her I heard strange noises like scratching or whispering. I still remember how her soft voice, reassuring me that I was safe, made it so easy for me to drift off to sleep. It gave me a feeling of peace, even though a part of me still held on to that childlike fear. I was about 6 years old at the time, and like most kids, I had my routines. One of them was asking her to leave my bedroom door open, just a little crack, so that I could run to her and Dad if I ever got scared. She'd laugh at the request, but she never said no. She'd leave their door open too, like a promise that they'd always be close if I needed them. A month went by after the scratching started, and I thought maybe it was all just in my head. I got used to sleeping soundly again, almost forgetting about those noises. That was until one night when I was right on the edge of falling into a deep sleep, and I heard it again. A slow crawling sound, like something dragging itself across the floor, and then the soft creak of my door being shut. My body felt heavy, my eyes begging for rest, and as much as I wanted to stay awake, my 6-year-old self could not fight the pull of sleep. Mom never missed a night of checking under my bed. It became a habit, something that made me feel safe, but she never once thought to check under her own. One morning, my dad came home from his late-night shift, and things were not the same after that. He found blood soaking into the white carpet by the sides of their bed, a sight that would forever be etched in my mind. The worst part was when he bent down to look under the bed frame. He found her there, or at least what was left of her. After that, life took a dark turn. Dad could not stand the sight of any bed frames in the house, so he got rid of all of them. From then on, our mattresses sat bare on the floor. The tragedy had broken him in ways I could not understand as a child. Social services eventually stepped in, saying he was no longer fit to take care of me. He tried, I know he did, but the weight of it all was too much. I never saw my dad again after they took me away. But I do remember the day they buried him. The rain came down in sheets, and I held tightly to an adult's hand as they lowered his casket into the ground. It was only 5 months after Mom's death. The silence that followed still rings in my ears sometimes. By the time I turned 7, fall had brought me a new life, a foster family that would eventually become my adopted family. They were good people, and when I was 10, they had a child of their own, my little sister. Even then, they made sure I knew I was loved, that nothing had changed. For years, our home was a happy one. The memories of my past began to fade, little by little, until they felt like some distant nightmare that barely belonged to me anymore. By the time I was 16, I thought I had escaped it all. I even allowed myself to dream of the future, to believe that maybe, just maybe, the worst was behind me. But then, one night, my little sister, now 6 years old, came to me. She looked at me with those big innocent eyes and asked me to check under her bed because she had heard scratching noises. I froze, terror washing over me in waves. My hands trembled as I knelt down beside her bed, every muscle in my body screaming at me to stop, to leave, to not look. But I had to. Slowly, I leaned down and peered into the darkness beneath her bed. It took a moment for my eyes to adjust to the dim light, but when they did, I saw it. There, staring back at me, was something wearing the skin of my mother's face. My breath caught in my throat, and I could feel my heart pounding so hard that I thought it might burst out of my chest. I wanted to scream, to run, but I could not move. My legs were frozen in place, and my voice seemed trapped somewhere deep inside me. The thing under the bed just stared back at me, its face too familiar, but horribly wrong at the same time. It looked like my mom, or what used to be my mom, but her eyes were empty. No warmth, no life, just a cold, unblinking stare. The skin looked stretched too tight over its bones, like it had been forced to wear her face as a mask. I stumbled back, knocking into my little sister's legs. She looked down at me with confusion, not understanding what had just happened. I was supposed to protect her, but I could not even protect myself. "What is it?" she asked, her small voice filled with innocence. I could not answer. I grabbed her by the arm and pulled her up from the floor, my legs finally finding the strength to move. I did not care how hard I was gripping her. We had to get out of that room. "Come on, we need to go, now." My voice trembled as I spoke, She protested at first, not understanding why I was so scared. "But I want to know what's under there," she whined. I did not let her finish. I dragged her down the hallway, not looking back. I could hear something moving behind us. Slow, deliberate footsteps, like whatever was under that bed had started to crawl out. My heart raced as I yanked her through the doorway into my parents' room. The door slammed shut behind us and I shoved the dresser in front of it, just in case. My sister started crying, confused and scared, but I did not have time to comfort her. I pressed my ear to the door, listening for the sound of those footsteps. For a moment, everything was silent. I turned around, trying to think of what to do next. The room felt colder than usual, and the air was thick with something that did not feel right. My parents' bed sat empty in the middle of the room, the blankets tossed carelessly over the mattress. They had gone out for the evening, leaving me to watch over my sister. Now I was regretting it more than anything. "What is happening?" my sister sobbed, pulling on my arm. I did not know how to explain it to her. How do you tell a 6-year-old that the monster under the bed was real? That it had come back for us? "We're going to be okay," I said, even though I was not sure if that was true. "We just need to stay in here until Mom and Dad get home." Hours seemed to crawl by, and all the while I kept my ear pressed against the door, waiting for something, anything, to happen. My sister had eventually fallen asleep, curled up on the floor beside me, but I could not rest. The fear kept me awake, my eyes darting to every shadow, every creak in the floorboards. Then I heard it, the scraping sound, like nails on wood. It was coming from the hallway, just outside the door. My blood ran cold and I held my breath, hoping, praying that it would go away. The scratching got louder, closer. Then a voice, low and raspy, echoed through the crack under the door. It was soft, barely above a whisper, but I heard it clearly. "Let me in." It was my mom's voice, or at least it sounded like her. But I knew better. I knew what was waiting on the other side of that door. I backed away, pulling my sister closer to me. The voice came again, more urgent this time. "Let me in. I just want to see you." The knob rattled and I could see the shadow of something moving just outside. The thing was trying to get in. Tears welled up in my eyes and I bit down hard on my lip to keep from making a sound. The thing outside the door kept scratching, begging to be let in, using my mom's voice to trick me. But I knew the truth. That was not her. It could never be her. I just needed to hold on. Mom and Dad would be home soon. They would fix everything. They had to. But as the minutes dragged on, I started to doubt myself. What if they did not come home in time? What if that thing got inside? What if it was already too late? Suddenly the scratching stopped. The voice fell silent, and the house was still once more. My heart was pounding in my ears, my body tense, waiting for whatever came next. Then I heard something that chilled me to the bone. From the other side of the door, the thing whispered one last time. "I am already inside." Those words hit me like a hammer. "I am already inside." They echoed in my mind, twisting into a nightmare I could not escape. My heart nearly stopped as I looked around the room, searching for something, anything that could help. But the room was still. My sister was still asleep, oblivious to the horror that was crawling around us. I pressed my back against the wall, my breathing shallow, trying to make sense of what I had just heard. How could it be inside? I locked the door. I blocked it with the dresser. There was no way for it to get in. But I knew. Deep down, I knew. Whatever that thing was, it did not need a door. It had always been there, watching, waiting, and now it was making its move. The room grew colder, like someone had opened a window to a bitter winter night. My breath came out in shaky clouds as I tried to stay calm. I had to protect my sister. I had to keep her safe. Suddenly, the sound of creaking wood filled the room. I turned towards the bed, my eyes widening in terror. The mattress was sinking in the middle, as if something heavy was lying on top of it. But there was nothing there. No one. Just the weight of an invisible force pressing down on the bed, closer and closer to where my sister was sleeping. I could not breathe. My whole body shook with fear, every instinct telling me to grab her and run. But where would we go? That thing, it was already inside. There was nowhere to hide. And then I saw it, the shape of something under the blankets. Slowly, the covers lifted, as though someone, or something, was pulling them back. My sister, still fast asleep, shivered as the cold air touched her skin. I wanted to scream, to wake her up, to warn her, but the words were trapped in my throat, choking me. All I could do was watch in horror as the thing under the bed began to emerge. First, a pale, bony hand reached out, fingers long and twisted, like something out of a nightmare. Then came the head, that awful stretched face that looked so much like my mother's. Its eyes were hollow, its lips curled into a sickening grin. It crawled out slowly, deliberately, as though it enjoyed watching me suffer. I backed up further, pressing myself harder against the wall, wishing I could disappear. The creature moved towards my sister, its fingers brushing lightly against her hair. She stirred, letting out a soft sigh, but she did not wake up. The thing leaned down, its face inches from hers, breathing in the warmth of her skin. My heart was in my throat. I wanted to stop it, to protect her, but I was paralyzed. I felt helpless, useless. This thing had taken everything from me. My mother, my father, my life. And now it was coming for my sister too. But then something inside me snapped. Maybe it was instinct, or maybe it was desperation. I do not know, but I could not let this happen. Not again. I would not lose her too. Without thinking, I lunged forward, grabbing the nearest thing I could find, a lamp from the nightstand. I swung it with all my strength, smashing it against the creature's head. The lamp shattered on impact, sending shards of glass flying everywhere. The creature let out a horrible, inhuman screech, its body convulsing as it stumbled back. Black, oily liquid oozed from the wound on its head, but it did not stop. It turned towards me, its eyes burning with fury. I had barely any time to react before it lunged at me, faster than I had ever seen anything move. I ducked, narrowly avoiding its grasp, and scrambled to my feet. My sister woke up then, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. "What is happening?" she cried, her voice shaking. "Stay behind me," I shouted, trying to keep my voice steady. I grabbed her arm and pulled her to her feet, keeping myself between her and the creature. The thing was relentless. It snarled and hissed, swiping at us with those long, twisted fingers. I threw whatever I could find, books, pillows, anything to slow it down. But nothing worked. It kept coming, its movements erratic and wild. We backed up into the corner of the room, nowhere left to go. The creature loomed over us, its grin growing wider, more grotesque, as though it was savoring the moment. My sister clung to me, her tears soaking through my shirt. Just as it reached out for us, there was a loud bang from downstairs. The front door slammed open, and I heard my parents' voices shouting from the hallway. "Stay away from them!" my dad yelled, his voice filled with fury. The creature froze, its head snapping towards the door. For a moment, it looked almost afraid. Then, with one last snarl, it slithered back under the bed, disappearing into the darkness beneath. My parents burst into the room seconds later, their faces pale with fear. My mom rushed to us, pulling us into her arms while my dad stood guard, staring at the bed with a look of pure hatred. "It's gone," he whispered, his voice shaking. "For now." But I knew it was not really gone. It was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its chance to strike again. And in that moment, I realized something that chilled me to my core. That thing, it was never going to leave us alone. After my parents rushed in, the room felt like it was full of electricity, as if the very air was charged with fear. My mom held me and my sister close, her arms trembling around us. My dad stood by the bed, gripping a metal flashlight so tight that his knuckles were white. He looked down at the spot where the thing had disappeared, his breathing heavy and labored, like he had been holding in more than just fear. My sister was crying softly into my mother's shirt, still too confused to fully understand what had just happened. But I knew. I understood, and it was worse than anything I had ever imagined. My dad finally spoke, his voice low and serious. "It's not safe here anymore. We need to leave. Right now." He turned towards the closet and grabbed a few things, a coat for my mom, shoes for me and my sister. My mom nodded, not asking any questions. There was no time for that. She knew something was terribly wrong, and that was enough. I was still shaking as we made our way downstairs, but I was trying my best to stay calm for my sister's sake. I kept telling myself we would be okay, that we would leave the house and everything would go back to normal. But deep down, I knew there was no normal anymore. There was no escaping what had happened, what was still happening. As we rushed through the front door, I glanced back one last time at the house. It stood there silent, the windows dark, like it was hiding something. And maybe it was. Maybe it always had been. We drove to a motel on the edge of town, the kind of place where nobody asked questions and everyone minded their own business. My dad checked us in, his hands shaking as he handed over the money, and we piled into one of the small, shabby rooms. It smelled like cheap air freshener and old smoke, but at least it was safe. Or at least, I hoped it was. That night, none of us slept. My dad sat up in the chair by the window, staring out at the parking lot, as if expecting something to show up. My mom held my sister close, rocking her gently in her arms, and I just lay there staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out what had just happened to us. Eventually, I drifted off into a restless, dreamless sleep. The next morning, we all knew what we had to do. My dad had already made up his mind before we had even left the house. We could not go back. Ever. He was certain of it, and after what I had seen, I was not going to argue. I never wanted to see that house again. I never wanted to go near it. We packed up what little we had brought with us and left the motel before the sun was fully up. We drove for hours, my dad's eyes fixed on the road, as if the farther we got, the better. I sat in the back seat with my sister, who had fallen asleep with her head resting against the window. My mom sat quietly in the front, staring out into the distance, her hands clasped together so tightly that her knuckles were white. We ended up at my grandparents' house, a small, cozy place nestled in the woods outside of town. It had always felt safe there, a kind of refuge from the world. My dad figured it was the best place for us, at least until we could figure out what to do next. My grandparents welcomed us with open arms, although I could see the worry in their eyes. They did not ask too many questions. My dad had told them we were going through some family troubles, and that was enough for them to leave it at that. For a while, things seemed to calm down. The woods surrounding the house were peaceful, and the air smelled clean, fresh, like pine and earth. My sister seemed to bounce back the quickest, forgetting, or maybe just pretending to forget, what had happened. My parents tried to act like everything was fine, but I could see it in their eyes, in the way they whispered to each other late at night when they thought we were asleep. But I knew better. I knew that thing was still out there. I could feel it. It was about a week after we arrived when things started happening again. The first time I was out in the woods by myself, just wandering along the trails. I needed to get away, to clear my head. The house had started to feel suffocating, like the walls were closing in on me. As I walked deeper into the forest, the sounds of nature started to ease my mind a bit. The rustling of the leaves in the wind, the birds calling to each other from the trees. It all made me feel like maybe, just maybe, we could finally be safe here. But then I heard it, the scratching. It started faint at first, just a soft, barely there noise, like the sound of twigs snapping underfoot. But it grew louder, sharper, like nails dragging across tree bark. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. My eyes darted around, searching for the source of the sound, but I saw nothing, just trees and shadows. The scratching grew louder, and I knew. It had found me. I turned and ran as fast as I could, branches slapping at my face and arms, the underbrush tangling around my legs. The sound of the scratching followed me, closer and closer, like it was right behind me. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I did not stop. I could not stop. When I finally burst out of the woods and into my grandparents' yard, I collapsed onto the grass, gasping for breath. I looked back at the tree line, expecting to see something emerge, something horrible, but there was nothing, just the wind whispering through the trees. I stood there for a moment, trying to catch my breath, my mind racing. I knew what I had heard. It was not just in my head. That thing, it was not done with us. Not yet. After that day in the woods, I knew there was no running from this thing. It was not tied to the house like I had hoped. It followed us. Maybe it had always been with us, hiding in the shadows, waiting. I tried to tell myself that it was just a coincidence, that the sound I heard was just the wind or the trees creaking, but deep down, I knew better. I kept quiet about it for a few days, hoping that maybe if I did not acknowledge it, it would go away. But the silence did nothing to help. The feeling of being watched crept up on me no matter where I went. At night, I would lie awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening for that scratching sound, waiting for it to come back. And sometimes in the dead of night, I thought I could hear it, faint and far off, like a whisper carried on the wind. A week after the incident in the woods, things escalated. It started small. Things in the house began to move on their own. A chair would be pulled out from the table when no one was in the room. Doors that had been closed were suddenly open. My sister's toys were scattered across the floor when she had not even been playing with them. My grandparents chalked it up to forgetfulness or the quirks of an old house, but I knew better. Then one night I heard it again, the scratching, but this time it was not outside in the woods. It was inside the house. I was lying in bed, my eyes closed, trying to fall asleep, when the noise started, faint at first. At first I thought I was imagining it, but it grew louder and more insistent, like nails dragging across the walls. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. The sound was coming from the hallway, just outside my room. I got out of bed slowly, my feet cold against the wooden floor, and crept toward the door. My hand shook as I reached for the knob, terrified of what I might find on the other side. I opened the door just a crack and peeked into the hallway. It was dark, the shadows stretching long and eerie in the dim light of the nightlight my grandparents kept plugged into the wall. But the scratching, it was still there, growing louder. I stepped out into the hallway, my body trembling. The sound seemed to be coming from the end of the hall near the door to the basement. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, and moved closer. As I got nearer, I could see the door to the basement was slightly ajar, just a sliver of darkness visible beyond the crack. The scratching was coming from behind that door, slow and steady, like something, or someone, was trying to claw its way out. I reached for the door, my hands shaking so badly I thought I might drop the knob. My mind was screaming at me to stop, to turn back, but something pushed me forward. I had to know. The door creaked as I opened it, the sound sending a shiver down my spine. The scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. I stared down into the basement. The stairs disappeared into a dark void, the faint glow of the nightlight barely reaching the top steps. The air felt colder down there, like the chill from deep underground was seeping up into the house. "Hello," I whispered, my voice barely more than a breath. No response. Nothing but silence. I stood there for what felt like forever, my hand still gripping the doorknob. I thought about going down there, seeing what was waiting for me in the darkness, but I couldn't. Something inside me, some primal instinct, screamed at me to run, to get away from that door and never look back. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands trembling. I backed away, my heart pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears. The house was too quiet, too still. And then, just as I was about to turn back to my room, I heard it. A voice, low, raspy, and familiar in the worst way. "Let me in." It was the same voice I had heard back in the house, the same voice that had whispered to me from the other side of my parents' door. My mother's voice, but it wasn't her. I backed away from the basement door, my heart racing. The voice came again, more insistent this time, more pleading. "Please, let me in." I turned and ran back to my room, slamming the door behind me. I locked it, then scrambled into bed, pulling the blankets up to my chin like a little kid trying to hide from the monsters. But I knew that the monsters were real. I had seen them. I had heard them. I stayed like that for hours, listening to the silence, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The voice did not come back, and the scratching stopped. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I fell into a fitful sleep. The next morning, I tried to tell my parents what had happened, but they dismissed it as a nightmare, a product of my imagination. My dad said we had all been through a lot, and it was understandable that I was still scared, but there was nothing to worry about. But I knew they were wrong. I knew that thing was still with us. That night I could not sleep. I lay in bed wide awake, listening to every little sound the house made. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the pipes sent my heart racing. But the night passed without incident. No scratching, no voice, just the oppressive silence that seemed to cling to everything. But it was the calm before the storm. 2 days later, everything came crashing down. It was late, and everyone had already gone to bed. I was sitting in the living room trying to distract myself with some mindless TV when I heard a loud crash from upstairs. My stomach dropped. I ran up the stairs, my feet pounding against the wooden steps, and burst into my sister's room. She was standing in the middle of the room, her face pale and her eyes wide with terror. "What happened?" I asked, rushing over to her. She pointed to the window. The glass was shattered, pieces scattered all over the floor. But there was no rock, no sign of anything that could have broken it, just the cold wind blowing through the jagged edges of the broken window. "I saw her," my sister whispered, her voice shaking. "Mom, she was outside. She was calling to me." My blood ran cold. "What do you mean? You saw her?" I asked, my heart racing. My sister nodded, tears streaming down her face. "She was standing right outside the window. She told me to let her in." My mind could not process what my sister was saying. I stood there frozen, staring at the shattered window, my thoughts spiraling. My mother? That thing was imitating her again, just like it had back in our old house. But now it was getting bolder, more aggressive. I knew we were running out of time. I grabbed my sister's shoulders, trying to keep my voice steady. "Listen to me. That wasn't Mom. You know it wasn't her, right?" She looked up at me, her eyes full of confusion and fear. "But it looked like her," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I shook my head, trying to make her understand. "It wasn't her. Mom's gone. That thing, it's trying to trick you. Do you understand? It's trying to get inside." Tears welled up in her eyes again, and she nodded slowly. "I'm scared." "I know," I whispered, pulling her into a tight hug. "But we're going to be okay. I won't let it hurt you." I could hear footsteps pounding up the stairs, and a moment later, my dad burst into the room, followed by my mom. They both looked at the broken window, then at us, their faces pale with concern. "What happened?" my dad asked, his voice tense. I opened my mouth to explain, but before I could say anything, my sister spoke up. "Mom was outside. She wanted to come in." My dad's face went white. He stared at the broken window, his hands trembling at his sides. My mom, too, looked shaken, her eyes darting nervously from the window to my sister. "We're leaving," my dad said suddenly, his voice firm. "Now!" He grabbed a suitcase from the closet and started throwing clothes and essentials into it. My mom followed his lead, moving quickly, as if the faster we packed, the safer we would be. I had never seen them this rattled before, but I knew they understood the danger now. "We need to go somewhere far away," my dad muttered, mostly to himself. "Somewhere it can't find us." I helped my sister pack her things, though neither of us spoke. The weight of what had just happened hung heavy in the air, and I knew she was just as terrified as I was. We packed up the car in record time, piling in our bags and anything we could carry. My dad started the engine, and without another word, we sped off down the long, winding road that led out of my grandparents' property. As we drove through the night, I kept looking out the window, half expecting to see that thing chasing us, following us like a shadow. But the road was empty, just the dark woods stretching out on either side. We drove for hours, the silence in the car oppressive. My dad's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the road. My mom sat next to him, clutching her purse in her lap, her face pale and tight with fear. It was not until we reached the outskirts of a small, sleepy town that my dad finally pulled into a motel parking lot. It was a shabby place, much like the last one we had stayed in, but at least it was far away from where we had been. "We'll stay here for the night," my dad said, though none of us felt safe. We checked in, dragging our bags into a room that smelled faintly of mildew and old cigarette smoke. My sister and I shared a bed, while my parents took the other. I did not think I would be able to sleep, but exhaustion hit me like a tidal wave. My body ached from tension and fear, and I could not keep my eyes open any longer. But even as I drifted off, a part of me stayed alert, listening for any sound, any sign that it had found us. It was sometime in the middle of the night when I woke up. The room was cold, much colder than it should have been. I could see my breath in the dim light of the clock on the nightstand. My heart began to race as I lay there, frozen in bed. I glanced over at my sister, who was still sound asleep next to me. My parents, too, were out cold, unaware of the sudden chill that had settled over the room. And then I heard it, the scratching. It was faint, coming from somewhere just beyond the walls, but it was there, unmistakable. Slowly I sat up, my pulse pounding in my ears. I looked toward the door of the motel room, and that is when I saw it. The knob was turning, slowly, deliberately, as if someone or something was trying to open the door from the outside. I jumped out of bed, my heart in my throat. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a chair, and wedged it under the doorknob, just like my dad had done back in the old house. I backed away, my eyes never leaving the door. The knob continued to twist, rattling against the chair, but the door stayed closed. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, as if whatever was out there was getting frustrated. My parents stirred in their bed, waking up groggily. "What's going on?" my dad asked, sitting up and rubbing his eyes. Before I could answer, the sound stopped. The knob stopped turning, and the room fell silent once more. For a long moment, we all just sat there, waiting. But nothing happened. Whatever had been out there was gone, or so I thought. Just as we began to relax, there was a loud bang against the window. We all turned to look, and my blood ran cold. Standing outside the window was a figure, its face pressed against the glass, pale and distorted, its eyes wide and unblinking. It looked like my mother, but twisted, wrong in every way. Its smile was too wide, its skin too tight, like it was stretched over a skeleton. It stared at us through the glass, its eyes boring into mine. "Let me in," it whispered, its voice muffled but unmistakable. I backed away, my whole body shaking with fear. My dad jumped up, grabbing a heavy lamp and rushing towards the window. But before he could reach it, the figure was gone. It disappeared into the darkness, leaving nothing but a faint smudge on the glass, where its face had been. We spent the rest of the night huddled together, none of us daring to sleep. In the morning, we packed up and left, not saying a word to each other. We did not know where we were going, but it did not matter. As long as we kept moving, maybe, just maybe, we could stay ahead of it. But deep down, I knew the truth. You cannot outrun something that is already inside.